Everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. I'm always pleased when I have someone who can speak to the academic side of comics, the complex side of comics, and visual literacy. And delighted to be joined on this episode by a person that I've done some collaborating with over the past year, and that is Dr. Suriata Abbas. Dr. Abbas, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jason.
You are an assistant professor, and I believe is it literacy? Is that right? The department?
Yes, the
At
Department of Elementary Education and Reading.
Elementary Education and Reading. All right. And that is at SUNY Oneonta.
Perfect.
Fantastic. All right. I am loving the office space. Mine, of course, is a digital background, but I love, I'm seeing some Jerry Craft back there.
Yes, that was a photo taken with Jerry Craft when I was at Hudson Valley Children's Literature Book Festival just recently.
Love it. Loving
Yeah.
the picture books that I'm seeing around. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you for panning for us as well. Now, it's great to be sort of steeped in a world of literature and reading and writing. And you and I initially connected because I was co-editing a 2-volume set that is fingers crossed off at the publisher, and hopefully all good things there, that looks at visual epistemology and thinking about research through the creative arts. So that was an initial connection. And then you and I were also on a Zoom about a month or two ago with Dr. David Lowe, who was on one of the episodes of this show as well. So great to connect with you again and connect across those spaces, and glad to connect anytime.
Well, I've been enjoying, the sessions that you had on comics and learning more about, the kind of things that other scholars have been working on, work related to comics, work related to visuals, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, editing that book has been a really fruitful process, because the nice thing about editing a book, there are downsides that we can talk about at some point. But the nice thing is you get to read all of this wonderful work from people, and you don't have to write it yourself, which is really fantastic. And then, of course, you get to share it out with peer scholars and things like that. So it's been really nice to see some of the possibilities of what people are working on visually. And I initially did not know about your interest and your work in comics. I'd seen some work out, in Google Scholar and different places, and I knew you were working on digital literacy and things of that nature. But you have a piece that was just published or is about to be published in literacy.
It's just published in the journal titled Literacy by the UK United Kingdom Literacy Association. So it is a special issue based on, I think, global transnational literacies. So that was a piece of work that I did, a research work, based on the courses that I taught, which is one of it is on a diversity course. So that particular research, the latest that was published, I think it's titled as what's the title? Critical Multimodal Literacy Practices using student-created comics. So they were comics created by my students as part of their course assignment, but also these are students who volunteered to be a part of the research work. So one of the courses that I taught apart from literacy courses is diversity. So I'm teaching a diversity course where students will be discussing controversial issues such as race, racism, discrimination, oppression, gender identity, classicism. So we look a lot at, issues that center on what's going on in America, as well as, in other parts of the world. Because when we look at, themes and topics that are related to race, racism, and how they are being played out in different parts of the world, but we also engage in discussions that sometimes students may not be comfortable expressing themselves. So I decided to use comics as one of the platforms for getting my students to understand, basic concepts. Because while these concepts, such as discrimination, oppression, they seem simple to understand from the text, but I felt that it is also essential to sort of like get students to think deeply about such issues, especially when, we know that in the recent years, there's been a lot of talks, the importance of promoting diversity and also how do we incorporate, inclusivity and equity in our own classrooms. So it was an assignment where I got students to pick a concept among all those concepts, topics that we have discussed, create a story based on, one particular topic that is of interest to them. So students pick, and then they develop the comic strips, and that is targeted at an audience whom we assume are not in our class, but we are trying to explain it. So the way that I got them to think about that was also to look at, recent news articles. How do we use these recent news articles to turn it into a story in the form of comics that they can call it on their own. Either they adapt the story or they, look at it in creative ways. So that's one way that I got them to think about such issues. And then at the end of the comic strip, as the author of the comic, the students will write an epilogue to explain a little bit more that will, as to why, they pick such topics, and what is something more that they want the readers to know that perhaps maybe it's open to interpretations, as always, in the comics. So yeah, and I look at the comics. They submitted 3 comics, because they are like, 1 week they submit comics, another week they will be submitting their own thoughts in relation to what goes into the creation of this comic. So because they are also like, okay, what meanings do you make out of those visuals and text? Because a lot of the times when we talk about, visual arts, how do visual arts and comics come into play? I think when we look at visual arts, we are looking at the different art forms that could be photos, that could be drawings, that could be web-based illustrations, that could be also videos and audio in audio form, which I think we will look at an example later. But one of the ways, these are some different ways that I got them to think about visual. My interest in looking at visual is also partly because when I first started my master's degree, one of my research area interest is in multimodality and looking at how fourth graders are using multimodal forms to express themselves using blogging. So that was an article, that was one of the research that I was funded when I was back in Singapore, my hometown. I was funded to present in a conference in Tasmania, in Australia. So, so that was also an opportunity where, I was invited to visit some of the schools there to share about multimodality and the work that I've been doing with the schools in Singapore. So that was how I got started in this, but also as a once upon a time elementary school teacher, I love drawings, and I always use drawings and also comics to sort of enthuse my students. So that is where initially I started off with comics, but also I love reading comic strips. And I think when I moved to a higher education, I have been exploring these aspects of looking at creative ways to help students to communicate a message, to make meanings, as well as to express their emotions. And So when I got my students to do their, to work on the research work, I also want it to be intentional. So when I taught the topics on, let's say, topic on oppression, discrimination, I do have a set of comics that I curated. They are written by some of our scholars in the field of literacy, in the field of anthropology, that depicts how comics can be used to communicate meanings that are topics that are centered on issues of social justice. So I use such examples to as an add on top of giving them academic articles. And apart from exposing them to news articles, because I want them to see that the topic that we're learning, they are real, they are also critical. That's why my research area is looking at not just multimodal literacy, of which I initially started with multimodality, but also I have that aspect where I want my students to be critical thinkers. So I was merging this critical multimodal literacy to look at how do our pre-service teachers use creative ways, because many a times our students are exposed to traditional modes of assessment, but I want them to see things that are different and how that could get them interest, enthuse them at a different level, but also provide them opportunity to express themselves in a non-threatening way. Because and I also showed them some examples of, like, okay, how you could be creating it in this manner, but it is not a lesson by itself, because many of my examples and the ways that I attempt to communicate that, they are intentionally woven into my lesson, because I'm a visual person, so I like to use like visuals and text, and then sometimes my slides are just visuals and they're nothing on text. So I would say that the ways that I approach learning impacted a lot on how I attempted to teach my students. They are very much visual, they're very much multimodal, and I use a lot of like picture books. I use a lot of like different ways, and one of the ways also to look at, I think I like to introduce my students to this book, which is Teaching
Yes.
Artistry. So I love the ways that, how we can tell the students that, you could be communicating, you could be talking about the same topic, but you may be communicating it differently. So I use a lot of such examples. And then like for a course that I'm currently teaching, I got my students to think about their reading autobiography. But I said, okay, express it visually using sketch notes. So I showed them some examples of like how I have done it very successfully, in my literacy theory courses that I taught, and I think these are ways that we often take for granted, the power of visuals that allows us not just to help us to make meanings, but also to communicate that message very vividly. And you don't have to be an artist to be able to do that. So
Absolutely.
yeah, and other aspects, the other ways that I've shown students on how they could use comics to develop their ideas or to tell a story is also by looking at the New York Times website, that maybe you can show it. I'm happy to like explain a little bit if you could screen share that.
Oh, absolutely. So did you want me to share it, or did you
Yes, you
want to
can
share?
screen share. You can screen share.
Oh, okay. Let me
Is it
make
on?
sure that I have it pulled up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So it is on New York Times. It's one of the comics that I showed students, available for free, and how I like it, how New York Times make use of that visual aspect, visuals in the form of comics, but you can see there's simple animation there. So if you were to scroll, okay, on my screen, you can see it very clearly. Are you able to scroll down with this?
Yes, and well, let's
Uh,
see. I think it's asking me to pay for this.
Okay, because on my screen it's probably subscribed by our university, the New York
Uh-huh.
Times. So I could see it very clearly. So anyway, in the New York Times magazine, this is one example that I showed students. So I also have a PDF version of it that helps students to see, just in case they're not able to access it. But generally, when I showed them, it is how the artists make use of comics, but you will
Mm.
see animated, like people walking down the streets in New York. So, which I thought was one other examples as to how visual arts has got that potential of what does it mean when you make meanings using visuals and text that are static, but versus those that are animated. How does that make you feel about the kind of meanings that you're able to communicate, to show movement, to show transition.
Mm.
So I also expose my students not just to the traditional forms of expression, but I introduce them to like ready-made templates on Canva to help them. I give them a choice. Either you do it traditionally or you do it using, the template that you can find on Canva. So
Yes,
use the
yeah.
free template. While there is a template there, students need to be creative because with freely available template, not all, not all, you can think about creating that visual where what you think may not be what you're able to find. So you need to be a bit creative when you use such things. But I've been very successful with that. Some students like to use pen and paper because they say it saves them a lot of time. So these are like choices that I provide for students. And then what I did was I analyzed their comics and I
Mm.
picked which are the ones that I think might be compelling for me to talk about it, to share with people in the academia and anyone who is interested in knowing more about, what does it mean when we talk about critical multimodal literacy practices, and how are we able to move on with such research findings, and how does it help our students not just to think about it, think about such issues in the local context, but also to think about it, in a more from a different perspective, from a global context, and that comics, this research work that I recently got published, it was also funded by William and Flora Foundation. So because it is a part of the we created it as part of open education resource, where students were taught about what does OER mean and how do you make your what your creation available to others, either like they can uh, they can reuse, they can reproduce. And what does that mean when
Mm-hmm.
you tag your comics with CC by something, Creative Commons, to make it like
Uh,
um yeah, for sharing purposes, apart from seeing it as just an assignment that is meant for me to read. It is available for their peers to comment, but also for for others to see.
yeah. Sorry about the New York Times piece there
Mm-mm.
that didn't come up. Apparently, I've hit my debt limit for this month looking at the New York
Okay.
Times. But
Okay.
I'll make sure to share the link as part of the podcast description so that as folks are listening, they can go and check that out. But I love
Yes.
that merging of criticality and multimodality because I mean, multimodality in its way is descriptive, and it's descriptive of what's on the page, and it's useful. But
Mm.
I feel like those steps toward criticality are so important socially, and to think about the steps that readers can make in not just taking notice of what's on a page, but noticing and thinking about some of those philosophies that are represented through what's on the page as well. And
Mm.
I also love that you're having students think visually and kind of take a step back from the traditional modes of creating,
Mm.
because sometimes even in a research project, uh, if you're looking at something through a singular lens, if you're looking through a singular mode, you're only seeing certain aspects of the project. And so to step out of yourself and to think through a question visually or some data visually, it can open up surprising results and help you see things. Speaking from experience and speaking as someone who's engaged in some collage and comic book based sort of work, it can really help you sort of think about categories of themes and pieces of your data that you might not otherwise have noticed before.
Yes, yeah. And I think it has got a lot of potential. So not just, like looking at comics as, traditionally, most readers think about comics as just a form of humor. But now
Mhm.
we can see that, the trend has changed where you find that a comic book like Muhammad Najim, the war reporter, I'm not sure whether you've read this before, but
Not. I'll
this
be
is
sure and add that.
okay. This is one of the graphic novels. I wrote a review of it through I can't remember one of the journal article that I submitted. So it's still, in press. And it's all about, how this boy who happened to be his experiences of being at war in Syria and how
Mm.
they as a family right now, he's residing in Turkey. So I got a wonderful opportunity of being connected with him because, uh, at some point in time, I was also looking at, the meat of like writing, what does that representation of childhood looks like for
Mhm.
those who
Mhm.
were at war. So one of the books that I selected is Muhammad Najim, the war reporter. I would say it's more like a documentary graphic novel where it's real experiences and it's juxtaposed with experiences. You will find very compelling visuals, and I thought it's very much action
Mhm.
kind. And if you're talking about visual arts, and one other potential is that it allows an artist to collaborate with someone who has experienced that something like Muhammad Najim, because this is actually written by Muhammad Najim and Nora Zeus. So
Mhm.
Nora Zeus used to be a CNN reporter at that time when this was written. So Muhammad Najim was just tweeting away his experiences when he was at the Syrian war, and then that caught the attention of the CNN reporter, and that's how this story came about. And it was all told through these comics, through this graphic novel, which I thought was it also provide opportunities for students to see what does it mean when we think about global issues, and in this simple form that allows not just students in higher ed, but also middle graders, or like readers who are ready to look at like broader aspects of what's going on around us. And I think graphic novels are perfect, comics are perfect, visuals, anything that involve visuals, they are perfect platforms that you can start very early for with the readers, with young readers even, because the ways that the messages are being communicated, it's very much I should say that it's in a form that is digestible.
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
and I think as we know, one of the potential of comics is that it sort of arouses interest among maybe struggling readers, or readers who may not be engaging much with reading. So yeah.
And there's something about the image that, on one hand, evokes. There's a sense of emotion that can be evoked from the image, but then there's
Mhm.
also this transferability. Images and visuals are seemingly automatically transferable across contexts, across languages, whereas with written text, there's usually more of a translation process. It's more of a slow and methodic sort of carryover. And really, when you think about printed text, it's visual anyway. It's
Yes.
not as though it's composed of some kind of
Mhm.
media or method that extends beyond the image. When, like, I'm looking at the words behind you, you are a writer, which I love that message.
My
It's composed.
manifesto.
Yeah, I love that. It's composed of four graphemes, right?
Mm,
Like you are a writer, and we've sort of chosen those little symbols to represent some of the sounds in this case, the English language. And so it's a visual form of processing, but it's not as immediate, and it's not as again transferable and accessible as the image. And that's not to say that some images aren't without their complication, or
mm.
that some don't need to be processed, because I do think we have to at times slow down and take in parts of the image. But it's an incredible way of communicating.
Yeah, and I also provided some examples for my students to look at how they could use photos with comics.
Mhm.
One of my interests is also, apart from looking at comics, I have vested interest in photograph. So you find that I've got tons of
Yes, I
photos
love it.
here.
Love it.
And they're all like, my students over the years, over the semester, apart from my personal interest in photography. So I showed students examples of how they could make their comics unique, different, creative by juxtaposing maybe stick figures with a different kind of background, a background that is produced from a real context. And one of the books that I introduced them is this book titled A House Without Windows. It is by Mark Ellison and Didier Kasai. So this comic book is actually a comic documentary about the street children in Bangui, and it juxtaposes and mixes photographs with comics, and you see that these are like the different ways that we have seen how comics have moved with the times, and
Mhm.
how like in the past we only see it as traditionally pen and paper form of drawing, is a form of illustrations, but over the years you see how technologies have also shaped that, multimodal modes of communication has shaped the ways in which we see comics are being communicated and how comics are being produced. Like you can find like some comics books that has got comics with photos, and this is one of them that I showed my students. And I do have like some students who use like our school background information as one of their one of their background, and I thought that was pretty interesting to see how you produce things that are creative, but also how you use that and why you're using it. That's very important, because you don't
Mhm.
want them to just picking backgrounds that look nice, but the meanings behind it. Because remember that the ways that I also sort of like guide them in the process of thinking artfully is also looking at what does it mean when you use one picture as opposed to another, and what additional layer or meanings does it make. So that is
Mhm.
the point that I'm stressing here, partly because I also want them to take away, one takeaways is not just using a text-driven form of assessment, but because we are now in an era where we receive we consume a lot of information multimodally. So as
Mhm.
consumers, we must also be able to be producers of that, the different modes, and how that help us to make us become more literate. And as we know right now, we have AI technology, which is
Mhm.
becoming, increasingly popular. And, there are many interesting ways of looking at how do we produce what do we want to produce in terms of that. Comics. And for me, I'm interested in student created comics, partly because I think I like to see, what my students are capable of doing in terms of like communicating messages, communicating meanings, because a whole lot of what I've been doing is meaning making. And I have a lot of comic books here, and the different types that are like, on my
Yeah.
shelf. Yeah.
Well, and as you're talking about that too, and thinking about AI, I'm thinking about, I think it's Kate Paul and Jennifer Rousel who do work in artifactual
Yes.
literacies, and
I have
uh,
been working with them. They have been
oh yeah,
editors. They have been editors of a good number of journals that I wrote. One of my most recent journal is on shellfish.
yes, yes,
So I'm one of those who created. I think that was during the pandemic, and I mentioned how I use. I got my student teachers to create shellfish.
hmm
It is selfie, but in the form of bookshelves.
yes, love it, you love it, yeah.
Yes, in an article, I think Digital Culture and Education Journal, if I'm not wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that call. I almost put something together for that, but I was working on something else at the time and I thought, well, that's an interesting concept, but it was one of those that
Yes.
I kind of had to file away at that moment. But yeah, the mark of the personal that comes through alongside the critical and as you mentioned with photographs, that reasoning, that rationale behind choosing that photograph, I think that's a wonderful step to criticality and as we're sort of thinking about AI and negotiating and thinking about the possibilities and the pratfalls, that's one of the things that I think is always going to be part of human literacy's practice, which is naming and noting those choices that we
Mhm.
as composers make. So I
Yes.
love that you're thinking in that direction too.
Yeah.
So we are coming down to our last 5 minutes on my ruthlessly timed personal Zoom. This is the elevator pitch moment for anything. But before we get to the end, I do want to thank you for spending some time
Mhm.
talking with me, and I also want to thank you for the piece that you shared in the volume that I'm putting together, and
Mhm.
we'll be sharing more information about that as I get it from the publisher. And looking forward to collaborating on other things as well, other pieces to come.
Yes, there's a lot articles out there. It's just, just like finding the time.
Yes, yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
that is the thing, as I mentioned with Shelfies, there's so many avenues to pursue.
Mhm.
And of course, everyone out there who's been in academia knows we get paid so well to write journal articles and book chapters. For those of you that don't know that might be listening, it's generally considered part of our salary as professors, assistant professors, associates to write. So there's not really that bonus on top that sometimes you might find in commercial writing. So, um, but I also love comics and I love literacy too much not to write about it. So that's part of the draw as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I look forward to working with you in our next chapter, which is on comics, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
because that one, yeah, I mean, I've submitted it way ahead because I know that, I think I've got a couple of things going on in summer. So, yes.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, looking forward to that and many more things to come. And I love that you are having your students think about and create in comics form because one of the names you held up on the book that he wrote the forward, I think, on the book that you were showing, Nick Susanis.
Yes,
Um,
Nick Susanis. It was forwarded by Nick.
yes, yeah. So there are folks who teach comics to
Mm-mm.
people who want to make comics. There are folks or art. There are folks who teach comic studies, which is this sort of analysis approach. And then there are folks like us that focus on more the educational. How do you use these things socially, critically? How do you think about them in a classroom space? What do they mean for readers and writers? And so I personally like to think that I step across at least two of those boundaries with comic studies and literacy, but I don't know. I guess we'll see how things land on the Vita and
Mhm.
what gets accepted and noticed and things like that. So
Yeah. So yeah, currently I'm working with my summer research fellow. We are doing comics for social justice. So yeah, typically what we did was because one aspect of the ways that I've been trying to introduce my students to research work is through arts-based approach, which I think you're very familiar with that. So I've been using paintings. I've been using comics. For this summer, we are focusing on comics, but in the fall, I do have students who work with me to look at how we can use paintings to talk about our community, because the topics are decided by the students, but I provide them with like guidelines as to how we could use visual modes to look at research methods, because I want that aspect of introducing students to research work in a non-threatening manner. So
Mm-hmm.
I use arts-based approach, partly also because part of my work when I was in Argentina, I use a lot of like visual field notes, which is the chapter that I wrote for your book. So that's
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
a small snippet component of how I've been trying to make sense of things a lot through photographic data, and then through visual notes that I wrote. Yeah. And yeah, that's how I applied with my students, and they got excited about it. I said, okay, so let's, do something a little bit more academic, but also, creative ways to think about subjects that might be difficult for them.
Absolutely, absolutely, and love that accessibility for the academic as well. I don't think that accessibility and academia should live in two sides of the equation. I don't think those are separate entities. I think that we could be much more welcoming in the academy in a number of ways, and one of those is the practice of what we share and how we share.
Yeah.
Um, but we're coming down to our last moment, so I'm going to let you go before it
Yes.
closes
And
us out. And looking forward to talking with you more, working with you more. And thank you so much, Dr. Abbas, for coming on and talking with me.
Thank you very much. And I hope you have a great summer. I look forward to more of your podcast series.
I will absolutely share them. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Bye.
Bye.